full moon at high tide on the cusp of summer. In an annual ancient ritual, horseshoe crabs, living fossils, emerge from the dark waters of the Delaware Bay to spawn. Their eggs fuel the yearly migration of millions of shorebirds, and the blood of these primitive creatures supplies a vital ingredient for the biomedical industry. The loss of spawning habitat from beach erosion is contributing to an alarming decline in the Delaware Bay horseshoe crab population. And in turn, the number of eggs available to feed migratory birds. Coastal states like Delaware engage in beach reclamation projects to buffer shorelines diminished by stronger and more frequent storm events. Superstorms like Sandy raise the stakes to a new and critical level, sparking intense conversation about the effects of climate change and solutions for reducing the world's carbon footprint, while the immediate focus remains on adaptation for minimizing loss of life and property from encroaching waters.
It's been said that the coastline is probably the most dynamic region on Earth because we've got the ocean, the land, and the atmosphere all coming together. So today we've got some pretty big storm waves and a high tide, so wave by wave it's chipping away at the coastline. The bluffs are retreating, sometimes as fast as 6 or 8 feet per year, sometimes inches per year, and it's actually quite stable here. So waves, high tides, we've got the occasional tsunami, the occasional hurricane, but the entire coastline is moving inland over time. And if we went back to the end of the last ice age, just a glimpse in geological time, the coastline here was 10 miles further offshore. So it's been moving back as sea level has gradually risen along with all that ice melting and raising the level of the ocean. The East Coast is very low relief. It's much, much older. So geologically, sort of had its origin 200 million years ago when the East Coast pulled away from Europe. So it's been worn down, it's been eroded. We get low relief, very low elevations, lots of sand dunes, barrier islands. It's really a depositional coastline.
In the United States alone, 125 million people live in coastal counties. Along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, barrier islands, beaches, and dunes are sculpted by the constant push-pull of wind and tide. It is a dynamic process, now accelerated by increasingly powerful storms and sea level rise. Fragile in appearance, these sandy ribbons of land and the wetlands they often protect are the first and best lines of defense for the people and property lining these coasts. In the last 100 years, human activities have released large amounts of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the Earth's atmosphere. The majority of these gases come from burning fossil fuels to produce energy, a practice compounded by ongoing deforestation. As the planet grapples with fallout from warming oceans and rising seas, coastal communities immediately in harm's way seek adaptive solutions for surviving new high-energy storms and protecting increasingly defenseless shoreline environments.
Climate change is definitely real. We have a lot of scientific evidence to tell us that the Earth is warming, the ocean is rising. Sandy is a glimpse of what sea level rise over the long term is going to do to us. As the ocean rises, it will become, it'll take less and less of a storm to cause coastal flooding. And so along the Atlantic seaboard and in the regions that were hit by Sandy, you definitely have a sense that people are thinking more about this and about the long-term risk of sea level rise.
From New York to Texas, a string of naturally occurring barrier islands parallel the shoreline. Many of these islands are popular vacation sites where communities continue to be developed and rebuilt after storm events. It's a high-stakes gamble, with insured property values in these coastal areas reaching into the trillions of dollars. In the eternal battle between wind, waves, and shoreline, change is the only constant. Highway 12 in Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, is constantly at risk from the effects of high-impact storms, despite efforts to repeatedly reinforce it. Here, population growth and a booming tourism industry are at odds with the will of nature.
Yeah, we're driving through Pea Island National Wildlife Refuge, and it looks more like a highway construction zone than a wildlife refuge. And they've been trying to basically fight the ocean here to maintain Highway 12, which is the road we're on that goes down the Outer Banks of North Carolina. It's really a losing battle, but they're spending an enormous amount of money to try to keep this road in place in one of the most dynamic areas on the East Coast. We've got rates of erosion on the beach here of almost 15 feet a year. Hurricanes regularly come through the area, overwashing it. We've had 2 new inlets formed just in the last 3 years. So there's an enormous amount of money being spent to try to maintain this road on this barrier island that is also on a national wildlife refuge, where the road construction's doing significant damage to the wildlife. Well, tourism is very important to Hatteras Island and this part of North Carolina. It's really the major industry, and the wildlife refuge is enjoyed by thousands of people who want to visit it every year. So we support access to the island, access to the National Wildlife Refuge, but we've got to do it in a more responsible and far-sighted way. We can't just try to keep this road in its current location and fight the ocean, because it's a losing battle. The ocean erosion is increasing. It's only going to increase more. We're losing hundreds of houses a year along the coast. These are basically investment rental properties that someone owns. They're in a very vulnerable area where we're standing. The water came through with Hurricane Irene, significant amount of damage to probably all these homes. There's some gaps back here where some of the homes were lost, but they all qualify for federal flood insurance. So we were helping to compensate them to rebuild the houses, or if they were significantly damaged, even compensate for the value of the houses that were lost during the storm.
Even though they're building in harm's way?
Yes, absolutely. The public, whether they know it or not, through federal flood insurance and other federal programs, has a significant investment in all of these homes, in that if they are damaged or destroyed, we help subsidize and pay the insurance for all these folks. The ocean's going to win in the end. So we really need to be thinking much further ahead and come up with solutions that will save the taxpayer money, maintain our beaches, but do it in a way that's going to be consistent with the great environment that we all enjoy down here.
Miami is the world's most threatened coastal city when it comes to assets exposed to coastal flooding and sea level rise. Florida, bordered by both the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico, has 1,200 miles of coastline, and 4,500 miles of estuaries and bays. Here, nearly 1.5 million properties, with an estimated replacement value of $386 billion, are at risk from storm surge alone.
During and after Sandy, the beach at Lauderdale was an area that's had extensive erosion, and they've had to go in and put in extensive sheet piles and do a lot of rebuilding and renourishing of that area. But they haven't cured the problem. That area is subject to continuing erosion. You can see other examples if you go up the coast. So we'd like to see public policy shift to encourage development to occur further from the water, and to put public infrastructure dollars further away from the water, and have more parks and beach access sites or wildlife areas along our coast.
We are not going to see ambitious action on climate change, I suspect, at the national level until there's a public demand, until this becomes something in the forefront of the public mind and people are demanding action. When will that happen? I don't have any idea.
The Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary in the U.S., with more than 11,000 miles of shoreline, including its tidal tributaries, and 18 trillion gallons of water. Today, the health of this unparalleled landscape, its once pristine waters and diverse ecosystems, strain from the impact of the 17 million people and matrix of industries that inhabit its watershed. Here, the effects of sea level rise are intensified by the gradual sinking of Maryland's coastal plain.
Well, we have many environmental issues on the Chesapeake Bay, up and down the bay, upper bay, middle bay, lower bay. The water is rising, erosion is taking out huge parts of the coastal area. Smith Island, the storied, historic Smith Island in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, in some places is losing 30 feet of shoreline a year. And this is all being triggered by a global consumption of oil, coal, and natural gas. We don't have a national and regional strategy for helping to harden our coastlines and to survive some of these impacts. So we need to think more and talk more about adaptation. And that can be at the county level, the state level, and God willing, someday at the national level.
Coastal dunes and wetlands are part of the natural habitats that protect 2/3 of the U.S. coastline from hurricanes and storm surge. In 1982, the United States Congress passed Public Law 97-348, the Coastal Barrier Resources Act. Using a subsidy denial approach, the law seeks to discourage development and preserve valuable natural resources associated with undeveloped coastal barrier lands. The legislation was co-authored by the late Senator John Chafee of Rhode Island and former Congressman Tom Evans of Delaware.
Just within less than a mile here, there are two towers that were erected back just before the Second World War. They were way back in the dunes. Now you can take a look at them. They're not too far from the ocean. The barrier lands are the first line of defense for the wetlands. Wetlands are priceless, and we've destroyed many millions of acres of wetlands in America. And it doesn't make any sense because they provide spawning grounds for fish and shellfish, sport fishing, commercial fishing, oystering, clamming. All of these things are so important to the tourist industry and important to people's lives.
The Coastal Barrier Resources Act, signed into law by President Ronald Reagan, is actually one of the more successful environmental policies in the history of the United States, although very few people have ever heard of it. If you've ever been walking along a beach, a developed beach, and you get to a point where the development just completely stops and you seem to cross some invisible barrier and there's nothing beyond that point, most likely you've encountered a control line set up by that law. It's a congressional act. Now, that law does not say that you can't develop those beaches. All it says is if you develop them, you're not going to have federal subsidies for flood insurance and for repairs after storms and so forth. That's been a huge deterrent for people. It hasn't completely stopped development, but saying we won't give you these subsidies has a big effect on the calculations that people make. And so it has effectively stopped development along a lot of parts of the coastline of the country. It was a law that was passed in a collaboration between conservative people in Congress concerned about subsidies and liberals concerned about the environment. The effect has been quite dramatic along our coastlines.
COBRA, when it first passed, it brought together Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives across the board. And all of them said, this makes a lot of sense. It's free market oriented. You don't stop development, but you do discourage development by eliminating subsidies from the American taxpayer.
Since its implementation in 1982, the Coastal Barrier Resources Act has saved U.S. taxpayers billions of dollars in federal subsidies.
You need to save valuable land that's important to our economy and important for the future, and you need to save some money. It may not stop sea level rise, but it sure will save some lives, and that's incalculable.
Today, there are more than 3.1 million acres of coastal barrier habitat in the system. Shunning the environmental benefits, development interests periodically pressure lawmakers to have parcels of this land removed from the system and exempted from protection. To date, these efforts have not had widespread success, but the possibility is always looming.
This area is one of the units of the Coastal Barrier Resources System. Florida and a lot of the east and the Gulf Coast, tremendous amount of the economy is based on natural resources, natural resource-based economy. So these areas provide habitat, they provide protection for the built environment. We ought to be augmenting those. Where subsidies are removed that stimulate development in storm-prone, flood-prone areas.
We still have substantial subsidies going on for coastal development and redevelopment, for people rebuilding in risky places. We still have a lot of subsidies going on to local governments when they get hit by storms and so forth. And so there's discussion in Congress about how do we do this intelligently and help people in the wake of disaster, but yet cut back on the writing of blank checks for rebuilding in risky places.
We may not have more storms, but we have more intense storms, and I think that's clear. And whether that's a cycle of nature or whether it's mankind, in part, I think it's both, you still have to adapt to it.
If we could have a combination of local government, state government, federal government working in cooperation with the private sector, we can plan for a future where there's less exposure to storms and sea level rise, and we get better quality habitat for the future.
In the absence of federal policy to address the root causes of climate change, environmental advocacy groups, state and local governments, and coastal communities themselves are working to adapt to changing conditions through strategies that include the restoration of natural landscapes, also serving as critical habitats and powerful barriers.
The coastal wetlands provide an incredible amount of value for states that are along the eastern seaboard in particular. So the average acre of a coastal wetland can hold between 300,000 and 1 million gallons of water. And so when you have an extreme rain that comes through, from a hurricane or some kind of tropical storm, every gallon of water that coastal wetland absorbs is a gallon that doesn't wind up flooding out a community right behind it. Now the challenge that these wetlands face is that, particularly in the mid-Atlantic region, you're seeing subsidence, so they're actually sinking a little bit. You have sea level rise accelerating, so they're actually having more water to withhold, and they're basically drowning. And so if you lose those natural systems, and then the erosion that comes from the loss of that, all of a sudden that water is going to wind up somewhere, which means further inland and further impact on property and communities.
Over the decades, agricultural runoff from thousands of acres of farmland in eastern North Carolina has polluted many of the creeks that feed larger waterways flowing to the coast, with crushing impact on aquatic plants and animal life inhabiting the waters. At the North River Farm, a unique public-private partnership is underway to discontinue farming and rebuild wetlands that will absorb pollutants and bring the creeks and ecosystems they nourish back to health.
Historically, we had actually cleared and drained an enormous amount of land on the East Coast, particularly in eastern North Carolina. And that involved digging ditches and really trying to get the water out of the land as quickly as possible. So those same ditches actually serve as a way for water to seep back in as sea level increases. The drainage ditches stop functioning as well over time. And so much of this property became much more marginal in terms of its value as cropland. And in the future, it will become even more marginal. So to try to restore it, you look at basically just doing away with the artificial drainage that's been put in place, and restoring the water table to what it was naturally. It's a great candidate to actually come back and put things back the way they once were. Having these areas revert back to their wetland state is essential in terms of the health of our estuaries and our fisheries and our coastline. It's all part of one big system, and what comes out of these headwater areas really controls the quality of our coastal water quality. These wetlands they're the kidneys of our coast. I mean, they make sure that the water flows into our downstream waters are not only regulated at a level that provides the proper balance of salinity in those areas, but also keeps them clean. And you destroy the hydrology, you destroy our coast.
So the wetlands actually provide a range of habitats. So a lot of them actually have more sandy shores, kind of along the ocean or bay kind of environments, whether that's in North Carolina or in Delaware or Maryland into the deep south. And so you have habitat for like shorebirds and for horseshoe crabs and for turtles and different kinds of marine mammals. As you get into the wetland environment itself, you see habitat for like fish nurseries for different kind of species. You see a lot of habitat for like waterfowl and other types of duck and geese. And then as you kind of move further up the wetland kind of environment to more of a kind of an upland environment, you'll have kind of strong soils providing good timber for trees for songbirds and the like. And so they really provide an incredible value kind of connecting these different systems in a relatively little amount of space, in a way that really does provide incredible ecological value for protecting these species.
Historically, many wetlands found in coastal areas were annexed for agricultural use or as game preserves, and the natural hydrology interrupted by draining and damming. In the wake of powerful storms and sea level rise, dunes that were protecting many coastal wetlands have been compromised, allowing brackish and salt water to flow into these habitats.
We're beginning to see some impacts from saltwater intrusion, and it can affect our groundwater supplies. It can also affect the land. And one of the places that we've seen that is down in the Prime Hook area, where there's been probably 500 acres of agricultural lands that have been affected by the breakthrough in the impoundments there. And that has caused the soils to be inundated with chlorides or salt, and they're not any good for cropland anymore. And so many of the wells, drinking water wells for our coastal communities, have to be very closely monitored. We're beginning to see some of those wells show elevated signs of salt, so we have to be very mindful also of that, because people's health obviously can be affected by chloride levels and salt levels.
Nature always wins. Once breached, freshwater systems will naturally evolve into saltwater systems as time goes on. In areas like Prime Hook Beach, Delaware, projects are underway to hasten this restoration process.
what you see now is really a shallow embayment as opposed to a marsh. And so our restoration is geared towards returning the hydrology back to a more normal tidal system that will allow Spartina and other more salt and brackish tolerant plant species to recolonize the site, which will hopefully give us more biodiversity as opposed to less. What we're looking at is a state of transition, where this was a fresher water environ when the dunes were intact and the system was artificially maintained in a more fresh water environment. So what you're looking at now is where the Spartina alterniflora, which is the salt marsh vegetation that we're trying to encourage into the system because it's adapted to these more saline conditions and will be more resilient. And what we're looking at also is the mudflat that you see will eventually be colonized by the Spartina. That's the whole basis of our restoration objective, is to restore this type of plant community that historically existed here prior to us manipulating the system.
The Delmarva Peninsula is a 183-mile neck of land framed by the waters of the Delaware and Chesapeake Bays and the Atlantic Ocean. Steeped in a tradition of farming, commercial fishing, and tourism, the Atlantic side of the Lower Peninsula is buffered by 14 undeveloped barrier islands, which have now been designated as an International Man and Biosphere Reserve, touted as the last wilderness on the eastern seaboard.
A lot of the islands have had different uses throughout the history of the Virginia Coast Reserve. There was actually a town on the southern end of Hog Island called Broadwater. There were Coast Guard stations and hunting lodges, and Cedar Island actually had a lot of summer homes and places where people would retreat on their island as well. The storm of 33 sort of sealed the deal for the southern end of Hog Island and the town of Broadwater. The barrier islands are a natural defense to any kind of storm surge or sea level rise that we're seeing. They protect the mainland. They are offshore of the mainland. Anything that happens, any storms that come off the ocean, these islands are the first to receive it. We don't have any inhabitants there. We don't have any structures per se out there. And so these islands are able to really protect our coastal bay and our mainland from all of that problem. In the late 60s, early 70s, the Nature Conservancy really had this foresight that we did not want the barrier islands to be developed in a way that the rest of the East Coast had done. And so we purchased the first barrier islands in the late 60s and continued to make these purchases and worked with our partners, our state partners, our federal partners, to make sure that really all of the islands are protected so that the natural integrity of them together are working to protect our coastal bays and our mainland. So the Virginia Coast Reserve now either owns or protects about 45,000 acres here on the eastern shore of Virginia. And it has allowed the water quality again to remain pristine and allows this restoration of oysters and eelgrass and the reintroduction of the scallops into these areas that really nobody else can do because we have this.
The idea is that if we can protect any of the oysters that were already in the sanctuaries and then do some restoration to get even more oysters in those sanctuaries, those oysters are going to be able to produce offspring that benefit everybody. So even the guys that are harvesting nearby, they'll benefit from having that big source of baby oysters there in all of the sanctuaries. The aquaculture industry has been great for us because they're great to have on our side when we need to argue to justify keeping our waters clean, and they're also taking a lot of the pressure off of our wild oysters so that poaching is not as big of an issue as it used to be.
This area is renowned throughout the hemisphere for its importance to birds, not only during the wintertime, but throughout the year. A lot of what we focus on with our conservation efforts at the Virginia Coast Reserve, those efforts revolve around the birds that are using the barrier islands during the breeding season, and then the birds that are using the habitats during the migration season, like the red moths. And that's a shorebird that migrates from Tierra del Fuego all the way to the Arctic to its breeding grounds. They also stop in Virginia, and researchers are just now discovering how important Virginia is.
we will stay the course. We will continue to monitor our shorebirds. We will continue to protect land. We will continue to do oyster restoration and eelgrass restoration and work with our partners to make sure that this place remains conserved and protected and studied.
More than 70% of Earth's surface is water. The greatest percentage of it is found in the world's oceans that are rising at a measurable rate each year. As humankind struggles to come together and find solutions for intervening in climate change, barrier lands and natural systems that can protect coastal communities now adapting to changing conditions must be preserved. There is no alternative.
Where the coastline can naturally migrate back or inland, where there's no barriers, where there's no seawalls, houses, roads, it can migrate landward. And at Big Sur, where the sea lions are, you can actually, there hasn't been any interruption, so that coast will continue to erode. They'll still have a beach. But if we build a wall, and this is the problem with many of the South Atlantic coastlines, Miami, when the sea level comes up against that wall, it can't go back any further. So we'll lose the beach, we'll drown the beach. And that's a real problem that persists globally wherever we've hardened or armored the shoreline that we're going to have to come to grips with. Mother Nature always bats last.